Ah, my child, welcome back. You've returned, haven't you? You're here to rest in the land of wisdom and wander through the foggy valleys of legends. Well then, make yourself comfortable. I'm about to tell you a story from the dusty pages of time. But this isn't just any story. This is one where fate weaves its threads and magic and betrayal mix together. Today, I'm going to take you to the great forests of Britain, to the times when the winds whispered the names of ancient kings. Back then, there was a man whose power was as legendary as his passion. They called him Uther Pendragon, a king, a warrior, and perhaps a pawn in the most challenging games of destiny. Without his story, the legend of Arthur could never exist. It all started on that stormy night. If you're ready, open your heart now, because this tale will capture not just your mind, but your soul. Ah, my young friend, let me tell you about a man who shook the throne of ancient Britain, Uther Pendragon. His name used to be carried by the winds, whispered by the rivers. Now close your eyes and imagine. Britain was a land where kingdoms fought one another, and the sky was always covered with gray clouds. Hearts beat with fear. Swords and axes were always waiting for the call to battle. Angelums nailed. Evil spirits and the invisible essence were always waiting for the call to battle. In the middle of all this chaos, Uther Pendragon rose. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a leader. His blood burned with fire, and his armor shone with that same fire. After the death of his brother Aurelius Ambrosius, Uther took the throne of Britain, and from that moment on, his name was known not just as a king, but as a legend. But this victory wasn't easy. Uther had fought with his sword, spilled blood, and made allies to claim the throne. He had strong friends by his side. The Duke of Cornwall, Gorlois, was one of Uther's greatest supporters at the time. But Uther's greatest ally was undoubtedly Merlin. This mysterious sage wasn't just Uther's advisor, he was part of Uther's fate. People whispered that Merlin could read the sky, that he knew destiny from the stars. And yes, they were right. Merlin strengthened Uther's claim to the throne, but throughout this story he would be both a friend and the cruel face of fate. Uther's rise gave new hope for peace in Britain. But remember, my friend, no kingdom is built easily, and no ruler sits on their throne in peace for long. Now let me tell you about one of Uther Pendragon's hardest battles. The Duke of Cornwall, Gorlois, had been one of Uther's closest friends. But fate, as it often does, turned friendship into enmity. The first spark of conflict between these two powerful men was over a woman's name, Igraine. Ah, this woman, her beauty was legendary, and she had stolen the hearts of not only the Duke of Cornwall, but also Uther Pendragon. Uther's growing passion for Igraine was the main reason their friendship fell apart. Invitations to Cornwall, celebrations, and feasts suddenly turned into heated glares. When Uther could no longer hide his desire for Igraine, Gorlois's patience ran out. The Duke of Cornwall began to see Uther not just as a king, but as an enemy who had insulted his honor. And that's when war became inevitable. The Battle of Cornwall was not just a struggle for power, but also a battle for honor between Uther and Gorlois. In the mist-covered hills of Cornwall, the sounds of battle echoed through the night. Uther's army was strong, yes, but Gorlois had the advantage of fighting on his own land. The battle raged on for days, with blood flowing like rivers. But my friend, the outcome of a war is not only decided by swords, but by the mind as well. Uther had Merlin by his side. This wise man made magical plans to change the course of the battle. As Gorlois's forces weakened, Uther struck the final blow. The Cornwall castle fell, and Gorlois's body was left on the battlefield. But know this, even this victory did not bring Uther peace. The Battle of Cornwall wasn't just about defeating an enemy. It was the turning point in Uther's fate. After Gorlois's death, Igraine became Uther's wife. But this union wasn't just the fulfillment of a king's desire. It was the beginning of the path that would lead to the birth of Arthur, a man who would shape the future of Britain. Ah, my child, history never hesitates to show how a man's passions can change the fate of a nation. The story that came out of the misty battlefields of Cornwall is just such a tale. Ah, my dear friend, let me tell you a story hidden in the heart of history, a tale where love and fate intertwine. This is not just the story of a woman and a man. It's the story of a union that changed the destiny of a nation. With the tragic death of the Duke of Cornwall, Gorlois, Igraine's fate took a sharp turn. Igraine was a woman known for her beauty, honor, and pride. But know this: sometimes a woman's beauty can be her greatest curse. Uther Pendragon could no longer hide the passion he felt for Igraine. After the Battle of Cornwall, Uther's victory would not only be completed with land, but with his desire to win Igraine's heart as well. But Igraine's feelings for Uther were far more complicated than a simple love story. As she mourned Gorlois, she found herself caught up in a new game of power. Uther didn't see Igraine just as a woman. He saw her as a symbol that would unite the Britain. Because know this, their marriage wouldn't just fulfill a king's desires, it would shape the future of a nation. Eventually, Igraine became Uther's wife. This marriage created a huge impact among the clans and lords of Britain. After Cornwall's fall, many nobles rallied around Uther. Igraine, as the queen at the center of this political move, rose in power. But you must know, the fruit of this marriage would be none other than the true hero of the legend, Arthur. Isn't it strange? A woman's fate could be so tied to the fate of a nation. Igraine's story shows us this. Sometimes, what changes a nation isn't swords, but the flutter of a heart. And now, my friend, I must tell you about a man who walked in the shadows of magic. Merlin. A sage, a wizard, a mystery, the mysterious man who shaped Uther Pendragon's throne and destiny was not just an advisor, but also a guide. Merlin saw Uther's dark passions, but he also understood that those passions could open a path to uniting Britain. In the aftermath of Gorlois's death, Uther needed Merlin's help to win Igraine's heart. But know this, Merlin's help didn't come without a price. Ah, my friend, the path of magic and wisdom always comes at a cost, and Merlin made it clear to Uther. Merlin said to Uther, "If you want Igraine's heart and the fate she carries with her, you must accept my condition. The child born from this union will be entrusted to my care. That child's fate will shape the future of Britain." Uther, overcome by his passions, accepted the terms. Merlin worked his magic. One night, he transformed Uther into the likeness of Gorlois. In Cornwall Castle, Igraine, believing Uther to be Gorlois, surrendered herself to him. And that night, the child who would begin the legend, Arthur, would be born as the fruit of that sacred fate. But my friend, never forget that Merlin's plans weren't just about satisfying individual desires. He saw something much bigger, the unity of Britain. Manipulating Uther's passions to serve his own goals was a game Merlin played with great skill. Merlin opened the path for Uther, but this path was filled not just with victories, but with challenges. Merlin's presence teaches us this. Sometimes those who steer fate are not the visible heroes, but the wise ones who remain in the shadows. Ah, my friend, what a pleasure it is to talk about that night when fate wove its delicate threads. The story of the child born from the union of Uther Pendragon and Igraine would change not only one person's life, but the destiny of an entire nation. But remember, this wasn't just any birth. It was an event where magic, fate, and the stars themselves met. On that magical night when Uther Pendragon entered Gorlois's castle in Cornwall, everything went perfectly because of Merlin's magic. Merlin transformed Uther into Gorlois's likeness, allowing Igraine to accept him without knowing who he truly was. And that night, the seeds of Arthur were planted. Even the stars in the sky seemed to recognize the significance of this event, because it wasn't the birth of a king, it was the birth of a legend. 9 months later, Igraine gave birth to a son. The baby was named Arthur. From the moment he was born, it was clear he was no ordinary child. Merlin, looking at the baby's face, immediately understood that he was the one who would unite Britain. But know this, my friend, such a destiny comes with great dangers. Arthur's birth wasn't just a cause for joy, it also marked the beginning of many threats. Uther knew how valuable this child was, but enemies were also aware of this truth. Arthur's birth had drawn the attention of many lords and foes. Merlin knew he had to act quickly to ensure the child's survival, for wisdom isn't just about making great plans, it's about protecting them. Now, young friend, listen closely. Even if you're the son of a king, fate might have you grow up not in a palace but in a humble home. That's how Arthur's story began. Merlin made a dangerous decision to protect him. He chose to hide the child among the people. Because wise Merlin knew this: the best way to protect from an unseen danger is to become unseen yourself. Arthur had to be kept far from the eyes of his enemies. Merlin told Uther and Igraine they must give the child to a peasant family to keep him safe. This family was a modest farmer and his wife. Their life was simple, but their hearts were vast. Merlin placed Arthur in their arms. There was no need for magic to hide the child's destiny for a while. Ordinary life would suffice. Merlin explained Arthur's hiding with these words: "This child will one day be king, but today he must grow like a common peasant. The way to becoming a strong leader is not through noble blood, but through understanding the hearts of the people. Arthur will be the conscience of the kingdom, not just its sword." As Arthur grew with his family, he lived like an ordinary peasant child, unaware of who he truly was. He worked on the farm, played with the other village children, and lived a simple life. But know this: no matter how hidden a child's fate may be, destiny will always find its way. The spark burning inside Arthur would eventually turn into a fire. Throughout this time, Merlin watched from a distance. He observed Arthur's development, the shaping of his character. But a sage's patience is great. Merlin was waiting for the right moment. Because when that moment came, Arthur wouldn't just be a child, he would emerge as the savior of Britain before his people. Ah, my friend, Arthur's story of hiding teaches us this: sometimes the greatest leaders start with the humblest beginnings, and those leaders rise not just with their own strength, but with the love of the people. Ah, my dear friend, let me tell you a tale of a king's power and a sacred sword that sealed his destiny. Excalibur. Just hearing its name sends a shiver down your spine. But you must know, this is not just a weapon. It is a symbol that represents the hopes of a people and the responsibilities of a king. Uther Pendragon fought many great battles in his quest to unite Britain. But one of the most crucial moments in strengthening his kingdom came when Excalibur entered his life. According to legend, Excalibur came from the mystical waters of a realm known as Avalon. This place is where the boundaries between the world and magic blur. It was there, in that enchanted lake, that the mysterious figure known as the Lady of the Lake offered Uther a gift that would shape his destiny. The story goes that one day, after returning from a battle, Uther Pendragon lost his way. He came upon a lake shrouded in mist, and there on the surface of the water, he saw a glowing light. This light was a circle of light surrounding a hand that held the sword. That hand belonged to the Lady of the Lake. Uther, in awe of this magical scene, knelt before her. The Lady of the Lake spoke slowly. "This sword can only rise in the hands of a king who deserves it. To wield it, you must prove not only your strength, but also your loyalty and justice to your people." Uther accepted the sword. When Excalibur glowed in his hands, a wave of excitement spread among his warriors and people. Because this sword wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of celestial authority. Excalibur was inscribed with magical symbols and words that read, "In the hands of the worthy king, it will bring peace to the people." These words represented not just the physical power of the sword, but also its spiritual duty. The power Excalibur gave Uther was evident on the battlefield. With this sword, Uther marched from victory to victory against his enemies. But know this, my friend, this sword was not just an instrument of war, it was also a tool of justice. Every time Uther drew Excalibur, he remembered his vows to his people: justice, mercy, and unity. But my friend, do not forget, the appearance of Excalibur not only sealed Uther's fate, but also the destiny of his descendants. This sword was a sign that one day Arthur would claim the throne rightfully. The Excalibur that rose in Uther's hands would one day be the symbol that united Britain in Arthur's hands. Now, the story of Excalibur teaches us this: power is only granted to those who are worthy to wield it. And a true leader uses that power not for themselves, but for the good of their people. Ah, my friend, just as every great king has a rise, so too does he have a fall. And Uther Pendragon's story could not escape this merciless cycle. Having carried the heavy weight of power and destiny for so many years, Uther was finally forced to bow to fate. Uther's final years passed under the shadow of wars and betrayals. His reign, which began with the dream of uniting Britain, started to crumble with internal threats. Disloyalty among the lords and increasing pressure from enemies wore Uther down, leaving him tired and broken. But the true downfall came from a weakness that even Excalibur could not protect him from: the mortality of the human body. Often where the body has spent life and lost all its strength. And from that, one day after returning from a battle, Uther was poisoned and fell seriously ill. The identity of the poisoner was never confirmed. Some believed it was the work of a treacherous lord close to Uther, while others thought it was simply a game of fate. For days, Uther suffered in his bed. The poison spread through his body, slowly but surely pulling him toward death. On his deathbed, Uther gathered his advisors and loyal warriors to deliver his final message: unite Britain. Do not leave these lands divided. But he knew that the kingdom's fate was no longer in his hands. He entrusted Excalibur to Merlin, who decided to hide the sword in a place where only the rightful heir could find it. And one night, in the faint light of the stars, Uther Pendragon breathed his last. Britain had lost its king. The people's wails spread across the land with the wind. But this death was not just the end of a king. It was the beginning of a nation's disintegration. After Uther's death, Britain descended into chaos. The lords, once united under the banner of one king, now pursued their own selfish interests. The throne was empty, and this vacancy became an opportunity for many burning with ambition. But this was the beginning of bloodshed and turmoil for Britain. The lords, claiming their rights to the throne, began to fight amongst themselves. Each lord, seeking to expand their territory, crushed others without hesitation. Former allies turned into enemies. Britain was no longer a unified kingdom, but a map of warring, feuding smaller fiefdoms. During this time, the people suffered the most. Farms were plundered, villages were burned, and people were driven from their homes. The lands Uther had fought to unite were now soaked in blood and tears. Among the people, the saying, "The kingdom brought us prosperity, but now under its shadow we perish," spread. Merlin, meanwhile, quietly watched this chaos unfold. The wise wizard knew what the empty throne would lead to, but his eyes were on a greater destiny. Merlin knew that Arthur would one day be the one to end this turmoil, so instead of directly intervening, he chose to wait for the right moment. This period of chaos in Britain led the people to pray for a savior. They believed that a new king would come to reunite the divided lands. But as a wise one, you must know that every dark age births a great light. and this light was hidden in the fate of young Arthur. Though these years without a throne were some of Britain's darkest days, they also laid the foundation for a great legend. Because, my friend, do not forget, chaos is often the birth pangs of a new order. My friend, the story I'm about to tell is one that demonstrates the power of patience and wisdom. Merlin, he is known not only for his magic, but also for his wisdom and foresight. After Uther's death, when Britain was being dragged into the darkness of chaos and conflict, Merlin still worked silently and steadily, because he was a part of a bigger plan to shape the future. When Uther Pendragon on his deathbed entrusted Excalibur to Merlin, it wasn't just the passing of a sword, it was the transfer of responsibility. Merlin knew that only the rightful king should wield the sword, but that king had not yet appeared. Arthur, the young boy under Merlin's watch, was being raised by a peasant family, yet he did not know who he was or how great his destiny was. Merlin was always one step ahead in the chaos. He watched the lords struggle for the throne closely, calculated where their hostilities would lead, and quietly prepared the stage. He gathered information from wizards living by lakes, wise women hiding in forests, and messenger networks across the kingdom. Every detail was a part of his plan. He was not just a wizard, but also a great strategist. One of Merlin's greatest efforts was to restore hope to the people of Britain and unite them once again. He didn't just present Excalibur as a legendary sword, but as a symbol of the leader the people longed for. One day, a person worthy of wielding this sword will rise, and they will reunite this land, he said. These stories spread quickly among the people, and in the midst of chaos, they began to wait for a savior. But, my friend, you must also know that Merlin's plans were not just about hiding the sword. He worked to prepare Arthur for his future role. The young boy was trained in knowledge, discipline, and morals. Merlin built a network of loyal friends and allies around Arthur to teach and protect him. He even reached out to Uther's old allies and persuaded them to unite once again for a greater cause. Spaniard, Merlin's efforts were not just a strategy. His magic and wisdom were a combination of the art of shaping the future. He dreamed dreams, studied the stars, and calculated the turning points in time's flow. Every move he made was like a move in a grand chess game, because he knew that Arthur would not just be a king, but Britain's true savior. And you must understand that Merlin's efforts didn't just change the fate of a people, they changed history itself. For, my dear friend, true leaders are not just those who sit on the throne. They are the ones who prepare the throne, the ones who plant the seeds of hope in the hearts of the people. That's exactly what Merlin did. With patience, wisdom, and belief, he worked to shape Britain's future. Merlin's efforts lit a spark in the midst of chaos. But this spark had yet to fully shine, because Arthur's time had not yet come. But my friend, do not forget, true leaders rise in the darkest of times, and Merlin was preparing the stage for Arthur's rise. My friend, now I will take you to a turning point. After the death of Uther Pendragon, chaos reigned over the lands of Britain. But it wasn't just chaos, it was also a void. But this void wasn't just the loss of the throne, it was the loss of hope as well. In this chaotic environment, Merlin prepared a plan that would symbolize the coming of the savior the people were waiting for. This plan was not just about magic, but about deeply understanding human nature and faith. Excalibur. This sword, once a symbol of power in Uther's hands, was now a symbol of the future. Merlin decided that only the worthy could wield this sacred weapon. But Merlin, knowing that a king rules not just with power, but with the hope he brings to his people, didn't just hide the sword. No, he turned it into the center of a legend. In the depths of Britain, at the edge of a mountain, he placed the sword in a stone. But this wasn't just any rock. Sealed with Merlin's magical power, it was a stone that only the true king could draw the sword from. And upon it were engraved the words, "Whoever draws this sword from the stone is the true king of Britain." Thus, Excalibur became much more than an object. It was now a symbol of prophecy, of fate, and of hope. When Merlin placed the sword, he knew that his magic would test not just the strength of the stone, but the purity of the heart of the one who was worthy. This wasn't a test of a warrior's strength, but a measure of a leader's spirit. The legend quickly spread throughout Britain. People came from distant lands to see the sword. Lords tried to pull it from the stone, but none succeeded. And each failure only heightened the expectations of the people. The sword had now become a living part of the legend. When Merlin placed it there, he hadn't just created a symbol. He had prepared the people for the future, because he knew that a nation unites with hope, and a king only reigns by rekindling that hope. Ah, my dear friend, now let me tell you how fate took an ordinary day and turned it into legend. Years passed, and Excalibur still patiently waited in the stone. The young Arthur, raised under Merlin's watch, was living an ordinary life. He had no knowledge of his past, and never could have guessed he would one day be king. Arthur thought of himself as just an ordinary peasant boy. One day, a tournament was held. Knights, lords, and people from all over came together for the grand event. Arthur, a young lad in service to his stepbrother Kay, was busy preparing Kay's sword for the tournament, trying to help him. But something went wrong. Kay's sword was lost. Arthur, afraid of his brother's anger, quickly ran to find a sword. And then, the moment came. Arthur's eyes landed on the sword in the stone. The boy didn't know what it meant. Amidst the chaos of the tournament, he approached the stone. "I can get this sword for Kay," he thought. And then, with all his innocence and purity, he grasped the sword and pulled it out. My friend, the act of pulling Excalibur from the stone was not just a physical movement. It was the moment when fate sealed a prophecy. The sword gleamed in Arthur's hands for a brief moment, like a star that had been waiting for years. Young Arthur, not understanding what had just happened, had no idea that the people around him were witnessing this act. "The king!" the first voice cried out, and it echoed through the crowd. And as Arthur stood there, holding the sword in amazement, Merlin approached him and bowed. "This is your destiny, young friend. You are the true king of Britain," he said. Arthur, though he couldn't yet grasp the magnitude of his fate, was understood by all those around the stone to be not just a boy, but a leader. And so, the story of Arthur, which began on an ordinary day, became the very legend itself. The pulling of Excalibur from the stone was not just the liberation of a sword, but the birth of a king who would save Britain's future. Because, my dear friend, sometimes fate takes an ordinary moment and turns it into eternity. Ah, my dear friend, listen now, for I will tell you of the moment when fate placed a heavy burden on the heart of a young man. Since the day Arthur drew Excalibur from the stone, everything around him had changed. People looked at him with different eyes, and his name floated through whispers like a legend. But in Arthur's mind there was a cloud. He still saw himself as just an ordinary young man. Why had he been chosen? Why him and not others? These questions gnawed at his heart. Merlin thought that Arthur was now ready to learn the answers to these questions. On a rainy night, as they sat silently by the fire, Merlin finally spoke. "Arthur," he said in his wise tone, "there is a truth you must know. This is the story that makes you who you are. But it's also necessary for you to understand the responsibility you carry." Arthur looked up in astonishment. There was a depth in Merlin's eyes, a weight. "You," Merlin said, "are not just the son of a common peasant. You are the son of Uther Pendragon. You are the legal heir to the throne of Britain. Your birth was the beginning of a destiny sealed by blood and magic." Arthur was stunned by these words. I am the son of a king? He whispered. Merlin nodded in response. Yes, young friend. Your mother, Igraine, was Uther's wife, and the true queen of this kingdom. But when you were born, we had to hide you away behind a great secret to protect you. For Uther's enemies would have sought to destroy you while you were still in the cradle. These words stirred a storm in Arthur's mind. He had lived his whole life not knowing who he was. He had thought himself the son of a simple farmer. But now, with Merlin's words, his entire world had been turned upside down. What now? He asked. What is my duty? Merlin placed a hand on the young heir's shoulder and answered, This burden is heavy, Arthur, but remember, fate has chosen you not only as a king but as the savior of your people. Your lineage points to a leadership that comes not from the throne, but from the heart. And this leadership will shape the future of Britain. That night, Arthur faced the hardest truth of his life. He now knew who he was. But this knowledge gave him not just a title, but a responsibility. Because a true king is not one who simply sits on a throne, but one who bears the hopes of his people. As the first light of the morning sun began to illuminate the land of Britain, Arthur's identity was slowly beginning to spread. The news that the young man who drew Excalibur from the stone would be crowned king spread like wildfire across the land. But the fact that the heir to the throne was so young with such a humble past raised doubts in many minds. Merlin knew that he would be by Arthur's side during this transition. Gaining the trust of the people wouldn't be easy, that's why a grand ceremony was planned. Before Arthur was brought before the crowd, Merlin gave him one final piece of advice. Remember, Arthur, Merlin said, a king does not rule over his people. He guides them, earning their trust. Arthur kept these words in mind as he stepped before the crowd. Hundreds of people had gathered to see the new heir. Lords, knights, and common folk murmured among themselves. Can this young boy really be king? They wondered. Arthur, holding Excalibur high, stood before the crowd and spoke in a clear voice. I am Arthur, son of Uther Pendragon, and the legal heir to these lands. But as I drew this sword, I understood that I bear not only the responsibility of a kingdom, but of my people as well. I promise you this, I will be a king, not for the crown, but for you. The sincerity in Arthur's words was felt by the crowd. His young age and humble background made many feel a greater empathy toward him. While some lords still looked on with doubt, support for Arthur grew rapidly among the peasants and common people. For the people wanted to see a king who was one of their own. Then the trouble began. During the ceremony, Merlin stood quietly among the crowd. His eyes shone, for his plan was, once again, taking the right course. Arthur was beginning to win the support of the people, and this support was the first step toward uniting Britain and ending the chaos. In the following letter to Arthur, that day the people of Britain recognized their young king. But for Arthur, this was only the beginning. For true leadership comes not just from gaining the people's trust, but in holding on to it. And Arthur would face many trials on that path. Ah, my dear friend, the king's greatest strength lies not in the sword he carries or the throne he sits upon. True power arises from the loyalty and wisdom of those around him. After winning the love of his people, Arthur began taking his first steps to build his kingdom on solid foundations. He knew that for this, he needed not only himself, but also trustworthy individuals by his side. Despite his young age, Arthur was carefully choosing those around him. He first gathered the brave knights who had defended Britain for years. Names like Sir Kay, Sir Bedivere, and Sir Ector formed a protective circle around Arthur. They were not only warriors, but also loyal advisors, confidants to Arthur. Throughout this time, Arthur frequently expressed his belief in justice and equality. He believed a king should not only be strong, but fair. This belief planted the first seeds of the Round Table. While the Round Table had not yet fully taken shape, the foundation for an understanding of equality between Arthur and his companions was beginning to form. This table would one day symbolize the gathering of knights to make decisions without distinction between them. The steps Arthur took during this period were crucial for the future of Britain. A king does not simply rule over his people. He builds a vision alongside the people who walk with him. The first advisors around Arthur were the beginning of a great story that would one day be part of the Round Table legend. That story read, "Now, my dear friend, let me tell you of the unshakable alliance between a king and a magician." The destinies of Merlin and Arthur had been intertwined even before Arthur was born. Merlin had been working to shape the future of the kingdom since Uther Pendragon's time. But Arthur was at the heart of his greatest plan. Despite his youth, Arthur always listened to Merlin's wise words. Merlin was not only a magician, but also a strategist, advisor, and friend. He guided Arthur not only on the battlefield, but also in the art of ruling the kingdom. Merlin's influence played a significant role in many of Arthur's early successes. But Merlin's guidance was not limited to practical advice. His prophecies provided Arthur with clues about the challenges he would face in the future. Merlin believed that a king's destiny could only be understood by seeing not just today, but tomorrow as well. He often reminded Arthur of the uncertainties of the future, advising him to make decisions accordingly. One day, Merlin took Arthur deep into the forest. "Look," he said, "this land is not only under your protection. Every tree, every river, every living thing here is your responsibility. But remember, a king must rule not only over his lands, but over the hearts of his people. When you achieve this, Britain will truly be united." Arthur listened carefully to Merlin's words. His guidance, filled with magic and wisdom, was shaping Arthur's leadership skills and inspiring him. Together, these two figures formed a powerful alliance for the future of the kingdom. And this alliance was not just between a king and his advisor. It was as though fate itself had made an agreement. Merlin, never leaving Arthur's side, guided him every step of the way. For every great king needs a sage to illuminate his path. And Merlin was born for this task. Ah, my dear friend, for a young king, sitting upon the throne is merely the beginning. The real trials are fought in the flames of battle, where lands and hearts are one. As soon as Arthur ascended the throne, he found himself in the fiery heat of war. Before his sword had even been baptized with the blood of battle, challengers began to rise one by one. Arthur's first battle came while he was still filled with the fire of youth. It was a turning point, not just proving his courage, but also showcasing his leadership skills. In the western part of Britain, a group of rebellious lords challenged the young king's authority. To them, Arthur was an inexperienced leader, unfit to claim the throne. But Arthur fearlessly rose to the challenge. On the battlefield, Arthur's leadership qualities became immediately apparent. He didn't just give orders to the knights around him, he became a source of inspiration that boosted their courage. With loyal allies like Sir Kay and Sir Bedivere, Arthur triumphed in this first battle. This victory not only defeated his enemies, but it also deeply affected his people. Now, everyone knew that Arthur was more than just a name. He stood where he rightfully belonged, as king. At the end of the battle, Arthur did more than defeat his enemies. He vowed to spread peace and justice across all of Britain. This was the first great step in strengthening his bond with his people. Through his courage on the battlefield, Arthur instilled not only fear in his enemies, but also hope in the hearts of his friends and his people. After securing his throne, Britain was still far from unified. The idea of a united kingdom was, to many lords, an impossible dream. Different regions of Britain were ruled by small kingdoms and tribes, each chasing their own ambitions. But Arthur was determined to bring these fragmented lands together under one roof. Arthur's first goal was to end the ongoing hostilities between the kingdoms. For this, he had to fight not only on the battlefield, but also at the diplomacy table. With Merlin's wise guidance, Arthur sat down to negotiate with his enemies and persuaded them to join together for a common cause. He learned that In this process, a king's words were just as powerful as his sword. However, success through peace was not always possible. Some lords turned their backs on Arthur's proposals and chose war to preserve their independence. In such moments, Arthur didn't hesitate to take up his sword and demonstrate the sharp justice of Excalibur. But after each victory, he always made sure to show mercy to the people of his enemies, winning their trust in the process. One of Arthur's greatest victories during his unification efforts was convincing a powerful kingdom in the south of Britain to join him. The leader of this kingdom, impressed by Arthur's courage and sense of justice, offered his people to the young king's protection. This success sent a message to the other kingdoms. Arthur was not just a warrior, but a leader who could bring peace. My dear friend, this was a turning point for Britain. Under Arthur's leadership, different kingdoms and peoples began to hope for a common future. The foundations of the Round Table were laid during these unification efforts. A king's greatest achievement is not just to defeat his enemies, but to unite his people and give them a purpose. Arthur was courageously walking toward this goal. My friend, if there were to be an object chosen as the symbol of a kingdom, it could be none other than Excalibur. Its brilliance, sharpness, and the magic it carried made it far more than just a weapon. Excalibur became a symbol of Arthur's fate and the hope of Britain. From the moment Arthur drew the sword, the tale of Excalibur spread through the land, passed from mouth to mouth. Some claimed the sword was blessed by the gods, others said it was forged by Merlin's hands. But one thing everyone agreed upon was that the person who wielded the sword was the true king of Britain. Excalibur wasn't just a source of physical strength, but also a symbol of justice and unity. The sword reflected Arthur's leadership qualities. He used Excalibur not only against his enemies, but also to defend the rights of his people. The sword became the scale of justice. When Arthur appeared with it, he was seen not just as a king, but as a protector. That's why the name of Excalibur echoed through every corner of Britain. Its legend lived on, not only on the battlefield, but also in the songs of knights and the tales told by the people. Scholastus retilian eritos sidil trium Rominum. Some said the sword radiated a magical light, illuminating the darkness. Others claimed that whoever wielded it could never be defeated. Regardless of the truth, Excalibur became the emblem that immortalized Arthur's leadership legacy. And so, in the eyes of the people, Arthur became not just a king, but the very legend itself. With the power of Excalibur and Arthur's leadership, Britain stepped into the long-awaited age of peace and unity. But this wasn't just the victory of one leader, it was the rebirth of the hopes and faith of the people. There was wonder and hope and promise, and Britain's regeneration made the world understand again. With Arthur truly seated upon the throne, the first foundations of the Round Table began to be laid. Knights from all corners of the kingdom flocked to Camelot, eager to be part of a new order founded on justice and honor. This new era marked the beginning of a legendary age not just for Britain, but for the world. Arthur became not only a leader, but a guide and an inspiration to his people. Merlin had described this period as the time when the stars shone brightest over Britain. And that brilliance wasn't just felt in military victories, but also in the prosperity and happiness that spread through the daily lives of the people. Justice was now evident not only in the palace, but in the village squares as well. Arthur kept every promise he made to his people, protecting them with both his sword and his compassion. But my dear friend, every beginning also has its end. As we speak of Arthur's rise and the legend of Excalibur, we realize how precious those days were. This new era was one where legends were written, friendships strengthened, and heroism shaped. And thus Arthur's name was etched, not just into the land of Britain, but into the memory of humanity throughout the ages. My dear friend, today I've shared with you how Arthur's legend began to take shape. I've spoken of how, with the light of Excalibur and Arthur's leadership, a people united and hope blossomed anew. This story is not just a tale of the past, but also a reminder of the potential we all carry within ourselves. And remember, this is only the beginning. For Arthur's story does not end here. These are merely the first pages of the legend. In our next meeting, we'll continue with the rise of the Round Table Knights, the grandeur of Camelot, and many more epic events. Now close your eyes and imagine the light of Excalibur. That light illuminated not just a sword, but the fate of a nation. Arthur's legend will continue to shine for centuries, and we will keep telling this story. Until our next meeting, stay in peace, my dear friends.